Church tradition tells us that Mark often went by two names, John Mark, a blending of his Hebrew and Roman names. He lived in Jerusalem with his mother Mary. He traveled with Paula and with Peter to spread the gospel. Mark wrote what scholars believe was the first gospel, somewhere around 60 AD. His book told the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He wrote it about 30 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. It is thought that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel as a reference in composing their own.
I begin my written story of Jesus this way: the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then I lay out the Savior's story quickly. I get to the point. As someone has said about my writing, there's an air of breathless excitement in nearly every sentence Mark writes. Of course there would be. I'm writing good news after all. I did not know Jesus personally. That is, I did not know him in flesh and blood. I learned about him from my mother, Mary, first, and then from Peter the Apostle. Peter came to our house in Jerusalem one night. He had been imprisoned for his faith, but an angel had set him free. He had came to hide in our house. He knew my mother was a believer. Peter told me about him. Peter had even more passion about telling about Jesus than my mother had. When the apostle saw my interest, he called me to be his assistant. Somehow he knew I had a talent for writing. So I became kind of a traveling secretary for him, and I watched and listened. One can learn a lot by simply watching and listening. Now, I didn't spend all my time with Peter. I also traveled a while with Paul, a powerhouse, and a problem too. He was a problem because he was always so fiery and sure of himself, at least when I knew him. Certainty is not so unusual for an adult convert. It was Paul's way or the highway, and soon enough it became the highway for me. My cousin Barnabas got along just fine with Paul, and he tried to convince that apostle to give me another chance, but Paul said no. Paul ended up taking Silas with him instead of me. But that's no matter. I went back to Peter, and it wasn't long after that I felt called to write the story of Jesus. Someone had to. The church was growing. It was telling his story. There was nothing to read. But I worried as that the first generation of believers died out, the story would be lost. So, at the urging of Peter, I wrote it down. I wrote primarily the facts of Jesus' life, the facts that Peter had told me. But I learned from others too, those who also knew Jesus. Many traveled with the Lord. And so I started writing. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What people don't understand is that the whole of my gospel is the beginning. Not just that first verse, you understand, but the entire gospel is the beginning. I end my story at the cemetery where Christ was buried and rose from the dead. I end it with this verse. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. I was writing about the women disciples, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother and James, and Salome, who came to the tomb to bring spices for the Lord's body. But the body was gone, of course, just as Jesus had promised. That made those women afraid, which is not surprising. I would have been just as frightened. All of us who love Jesus would have. So I pulled no punches in my writing. No fancy happy ending to my gospel, no sappy sentimentary, just the truth. They did flee from the tomb. Fear was rampant in the land those days. It still is, I would guess. But the disciples, both men and women, got over their fear. They told the story near and far. Otherwise, I would have never heard about Jesus. I would have had no gospel to write without their courageous witness. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's how I began my gospel. It's a story still fresh and new. The gospel is still beginning, moving out into the world. I wonder, how will you tell the story for others to hear?